Creepypasta are great, but does anyone have any good true creepy stories? It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story, since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward first date, and around the time that they would have said good night, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again, and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer, Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon, and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason, just turn around and walk away. TLDR. Friend's parents stumbled onto a fresh corpse left by Ted Bundy on their first date. A few weeks ago my girlfriend and I were sleeping together, when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake, and I asked what she was talking about. She then woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream, or semi-awake hallucination, we thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed, with the sheets wrapped up and twisted to their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I had been dreaming the exact same thing that she did, and said the exact same thing. I know it's the power of suggestion or whatever, but fuck that. When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. We'd chill out and I vividly remember him telling me stories, although I have absolutely no recollection of what they actually were. I remember one day talking to my parents about it. Dad traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into, and when I started telling him about my dresser buddy, he wanted to know his name. It was something innocent like Peter or Patrick, but I can still see him going white in the face. I drew Peter/Patrick out for him, and the very next day him and my uncle took out that dresser and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later when I found out my dad's little brother, my uncle, also had the same friend with the same name who lived in the same antique dresser. After a few months of the typical imaginary friend shit, My uncle started having night terrors and couldn't sleep because of Peter/Patrick. It got so bad that they had to move him out of his room before he managed to get back to normal. Thanks for the gold, kind stranger. Schemed through the comments and will probably answer the most common questions. The dresser was an old darkwood ugly thing. As far as we know, it belonged to my great-great-grandfather, who had always been into some weird shit if family history is to be believed. Dad never talked about what was actually in the dresser, and he was the only one who believed his brother when they were kids. Their parents didn't really care because they thought kids were just being kids, and who honestly believed in spooky ghosts back then? Must have been a shock that 30 years later, his own son started having the same friend. My uncle's night terrors ended when they moved him to another room. The bedroom he was in with the dresser was converted into a little sitting room since it had some nice views. It remained relatively unlived in until Dad moved our family into that home, and that room became mine. 4. I haven't seen my uncle in 14 years now. Don't really speak to him since he is on the other end of the world. Afraid to bring something like this up since I know he struggles with depression and alcoholism, so I would hate to add stuff to his plate. 5. To everyone asking what he looked like, I remember tiny old man. Not like old man tiny, but kid-sized tiny. He had very large hands, long fingers. Which in turn led to how I draw people even today. Hands always come out longer and larger than what they would normally be. Smelled of wood, mothballs, old cloths, and what I now know is mold. From this thread about weird shit kids say. I was visiting family for winter break in Los Angeles. This was about 5 years ago. I was heading to the bathroom on the second floor of my aunt's house when I saw my cousin, April, on the stairs. April was 4 and very animated. She was busy making funny faces while sitting on the stairs. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." I looked around, there was no one else but us. I asked, "Where is the lady, April?" She pointed to a beam running parallel to the stairwell. I asked April, "What is the lady doing?" She said, "Making funny faces." I smiled and started walking up the stairs again when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. "April, her braids is around her neck." I turned back and asked April to repeat herself. April pointed, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." Then April started making a face which I then realized was it someone gasping for air. About a couple weeks after I was born, my dad's best friend, Jim, died. They were really close, and one of the last things he wanted was to hold little me before he passed. His wish was filled, and some short time after that he was gone. Fast forward 7 years. I'm now a happy 7-year-old with a 5-year-old brother and recently born sister. One day the phone rings, and with my mom out and dad in the washroom, I thought it was going to be ignored as we kids were still too young to answer the phone. No call display, we didn't know if there would be a stranger. But my brother broke the rules and answered. "Hello." At this point my dad is out of the washroom and is asking my brother to hand him the phone. He ignores him and keeps listening to whoever is speaking. Before my dad could ask a second time, my brother hangs up, looks at him and says, "Jim says hi," and he misses Skywing Nova, then goes back to playing. The look of shock my dad had is what I remember most about this. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening. My son, 3 at the time, needed to go to bed at that point. I walked with him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room that my mother-in-law passed away in was upstairs, and straight down the hallway as you reached the top of the landing. My son and I walked upstairs together, with me holding his hand. As we nearly reached the top of the stairs, my son stopped and wouldn't move, at the point which he could just see down the hallway. He was staring straight down the hall. I looked at him, then down the hall to an open doorway to a completely dark bedroom. He just stared, and would not move any further. I asked him, "Buddy, are you okay?" His response was, "Daddy. The light. The light scares me." I looked again down the hallway where he was staring into darkness. "Buddy, you see a light?" "Yes, Daddy. It scares me." I promptly picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs still stand on the back of my neck when I think of it. This happened to a friend of mine. She told me about it a year or so ago. We'll call her Minji. Minji is in her late 20s, and works as an English tutor in South Korea. One evening, a few years ago, she was tutoring a high school boy. They were up studying pretty late, and the buses stopped running. Being a long way from his house, the boy asked if he could crash on her floor overnight and get the first bus the next morning. Minji was very reluctant, because inviting a teenage male student to stay the night didn't sound like a great idea, but he was begging her and eventually she relented. They went back to her one-room apartment, and she got into the bed, while he laid a blanket out on the floor, and they both fell asleep. A few hours later, at maybe 2 a.m., the boy wakes Minji up. "I'm really hungry," he says, "let's go get some food." Minji opens her eyes and looks up at him in disbelief. "Food? Now? It's 2 a.m., go back to bed." But the student insists, "No, I'm so hungry, let's eat something now." She tells him that there's some ramen in the kitchen, and he can fix himself some. This doesn't satisfy him. He doesn't want ramen. "There's a 24-hour place just down the road, let's go there." Eventually, after several minutes of persuasion, the boy gets Minji to come with him to the restaurant. They leave the apartment and head out. As soon as they're on the street, the boy turns to Minji, and says, "I'm not hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night, and looked under your bed. There's a man sleeping there." They call the police, and discover that a homeless man had been living in Minji's apartment, sleeping under her bed, for over 2 months. The boy only saw him because he was lying on her floor, so had a clear view under the bed. The police arrested the man, and thankfully there were no other issues, but that's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to anyone I know. One of my brothers works security in one of New York City's most upscale hotels. The security desk received a frantic call during one of his night shifts. A guy was calling, all freaked out that his wife was in the bath and was not breathing. My brother and another security guard rushed upstairs to the room. Sure enough, they found a woman in the tub, and she was unresponsive. My brother and the other guard got her out of the tub and attempted CPR. In the interim, during resuscitation attempts, the NYPD arrived. They told my brother to stop CPR because the lady was obviously dead and, in their opinion, had been for a couple of hours. The husband was questioned extensively. He told law enforcement that he and his wife had a fight earlier in the evening. He went out on his own, and when he came back, his wife was in the bath. He says he went to bed at that point but later became concerned when his wife didn't come to bed. Privately, among all those present, the general consensus was that the husband had something to do with it, but it could not be proven. A couple of weeks later, the room was again made available to guests, and of course the incident was not mentioned. A woman who frequently stayed at the hotel made a reservation for a week and was assigned to that room. She was the first person to stay in the room since the incident. She came to the front desk first thing in the morning, very upset, and with all of her luggage in tow. She said that she was canceling the rest of her reservation and that she would never be staying in the hotel again. She said that she did not sleep the entire night and that the room was haunted. No one at the hotel had mentioned to her what had previously transpired in the room. While my brother worked there, every guest who stayed in the room called about strange goings-on, and many asked to be switched to another room. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip that was called the Louisiana Tour. It was mostly going around to significant sites in South Louisiana. One of the places we went was Myrtle's Plantation, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point we were standing in a room as a part of a larger group and the tour guide was talking about something, I don't remember what. As I'm standing there, I start to hear what sounds like someone hitting a piano key. After I heard it a couple of times, I started to look around for the source of the noise. I didn't see a piano, but I kept hearing it. So I asked my friends who were standing near me if they heard it. They said no. When I heard it again, I said there is it again and that they must have heard it. They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide except for one woman. She caught my eye and pointed at me and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I heard it too, and I nodded. At this point the tour guide starts telling a story about a soldier who had died there and that he played the piano and multiple guests had reported hearing him playing in the night. I honestly didn't know what to think. I guess I still don't. I talked to the woman as we were all leaving the room and she had heard the exact same thing as me, but her husband and son had not heard it. I should start off by saying my brother is not only a military man, but he's your basic hetero never let them see you cry cliché of a military man. He's not afraid of anything, well, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while. The girls, specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights where him and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with girls, the guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, He tells my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early was because his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point in the story, I should explain how this guy's house was shaped. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe, with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U-shape and his sister's all the way at the other end. So they are essentially across the garden from each other. If he looks out of his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So anyways, they decide to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window to look across the garden into his sister's window, to check on her. He lifts the blind and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look and he stops him. He tells him that he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother, naturally, does not believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window and lifts the blind, but this time, he finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with a face. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the guy's covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer, and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe, or if maybe they drank more than what they said they did that night and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. Edit: my brother isn't gay. He is probably the least likely to be gay person on earth. If you think he handled the situation badly, next time your reality comes crashing down and you go from not believing in ghosts to seeing one with your own eyes, let us know how you handled it. It's easy to sound brave when it didn't happen to you. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I've had one experience that I just can't explain. So it was about a year ago when I had my paranormal encounter. I had just woke up with a case of morning wood that would not go away, so the only option at that point was to smack around the old one-eyed monster. It's important to note that my dad and I had just moved into this old, fixer-upper, house and the bathroom was the only room with a door. So everything's going just swell when the unexplainable happens. I'm slapped square across the face mid-jerk. What the fuck? So here I am sitting on my toilet, dick in hand, trying to process what the fuck just happened. I knew I didn't just imagine this and I'm pretty creeped out at this point. I was so overwhelming confused I did the only thing I could, I finished. So I can only assume this ghost or whatever stared into my soul as it could see my vinegar strokes and was probably just as disgusted with me as I was. And yeah, it was weird. TLDR, ghost caught me beating my meat and I guess it didn't like what it saw. When I was younger my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on some land my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and was covered in woods. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king and there was nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. It was also the type of town, along with it being early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry too much about locking their doors or setting an alarm. Now, our trailer was a 2-bedroom and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it, and my sister's room was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, my dad is woken up by a feeling that there is someone in the room. He looks around a bit and sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch next to his bed and saw it was a neighbor from down the road named Carter. Carter was known to be a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of these. My dad asked him what the fuck he was doing here and told him to get out, and he responded, "I can't get out. The demons are chasing me and your house is the only safe one." My dad, who I should is fairly large and terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out and get out quickly that the house would be a lot less safe for him. "If I leave they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night. If they catch me I'm dead." My dad's response was that there was no demons, but that if he didn't get the fuck out of his house that he'd be dead. From what I've been told, since I was asleep for this part, my mom also hurled a few threats and, while she may not be big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. My dad got up and locked the door and watched through the blinds as Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old beater Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. He drove around for about an hour. We called the police and it took them about that long to get out to us since the closest police station was about 20 or 30 minutes away. He finally brought it back and was arrested and taken to jail. He was deemed crazy and ended up locked in a mental institution. The scarier part is that for years after this we'd get phone calls where all we'd hear is music that would have lyrics like "I'm going to fucking kill you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we always had different numbers and would even be in different states. We always thought it was him sending us a message. The calls stopped when I was about 12. I later found out that it was around that time that Carter thought the best thing he could do for himself was soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire. Throw away, because I've told people this story before and it's pretty recognizable. My school's library is open until around 2 in the morning for the idiots like me who don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. Just to give you a quick layout, there's the big main stairs that go down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and the long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway with a huge amount of bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks working in one of the study desks so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and downstairs again. I had been there for maybe 2 hours and everyone except for a boy working a few desks down from me had left already. I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time until it was due and I was sort of panicking, so it really pissed me off when I heard someone flipping through book pages really fast to make them do that loud whir noise at the other end of the room. I sort of ignored it for a while thinking they'd go away eventually, but they just kept doing it. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started to walk over to tell them to knock it off. I get about 3 steps across the room and it just stopped. I sat back down and it was quiet again for like 10 more minutes before the flipping pages noise started again, only loads louder, like they'd grabbed a huge book that time. The boy started to get pissed off too, and he stood up and started walking through the bookshelves trying to find them. It keeps going, so I got up too and started looking around with him. It got really loud and it was pretty obvious where it was coming from by that point, so we started walking towards it. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves. No one there. We hadn't seen anyone come in the stacks and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. No way could anyone have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again and we both just sort of slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down and immediately the noise started again. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the guy's chair. He shoved his stuff in his bag, looked at me, said, "Fuck this," and took off. I was out of there maybe 5 seconds behind him. I still won't go back in the stacks at night, even when there's other people down there. No essays worth getting murdered by a weird book ghost. Hard to say what qualifies as creepy. It could maybe be seen as heartwarming. I don't know. My mother swears this is a true story, and frankly, I don't see why she would lie about it. My mom had 3 kids. There's me, the youngest, and my older brother, but before either of us were born, there was Jonathan. He was a sweet little blonde boy, big blue eyes, known for accidentally repeating Dad's swears in church. Wholesome kid, great in school, active outside. When he was almost 6, he was riding his bike and fell and hit his head on a rock. He got up and said he felt fine. My mom found him the next morning in his bed when she tried to wake him up to get to kindergarten, one pupil dilated and the other not. She got him airlifted to the nearest hospital. During this time, Jonathan's best friend Nick was sitting at the breakfast table eating cereal. Nick suddenly gets up from the table and goes to the door. When his mom asks him what's up, Nick says that Johnny was calling for him. You see, Nick and Johnny lived on separate blocks, but they weren't allowed to cross the street without a parent yet because they were still fairly young. But they lived close enough to call to one another to come out to talk at their respective street corners. So Nick goes out to the street corner while his mother receives a call from mine that Johnny was just declared dead in the hospital, idle brain aneurysm that was triggered by the fall. Nick's mom can hardly handle this news and is now wondering where her son went. But Nick comes back a few minutes later and says that he heard Johnny calling to him but he wasn't at the street corner when he looked, then sits down to continue eating his cereal. When his mom asks Nick what Johnny was saying, Nick says he had come to say goodbye. My mom told me this story when I was young, but it stuck with me. I wish I could have met him. But truthfully, I wouldn't be here to type this story to all you random strangers if he hadn't died. My mother only wanted 2 kids. I'm thankful for the chance I was given to live, and feel like he died for me sometimes. I'm not religious, but I do feel spiritual when I think of Johnny. Obligatory edit. I submitted this in between classes and am legitimately surprised to see it was read by more than one person. Thanks for reading a part of Johnny's story. It's scary to think of a little trigger in your brain just waiting to be set off to kill, but my parents said if they had known, it was the 80s and there was no reason to suspect such a thing would be an issue for such a bright, energetic boy, Johnny wouldn't have gotten to do all the fun things he ended up doing, playing baseball, climbing trees, and just being a kid. And that would have been like having no life at all.